Amen. And we're starting a brand new series. We are starting a brand new series today. I'm a little bit nervous and pretty excited about this series because this series, well, it's been you guys who are dictating what the subject matter is for this whole sermon series. And so the series is entitled "You Asked for It," and today's topic is the topic of creation versus evolution. So that was came in on the card, and let's hit it out of the park right out of the gate. We're going to tackle this one. You're going to leave encouraged, and I want to give you kind of a challenge, just an observational challenge by the end, but we're going to go through both the tenets of creation, which is the biblical storyline, and then the evolutionary storyline as well. Tell the two stories, because essentially that's all we've got. And then we're asking this question: which story best explains why anything exists at all? So how did we get here? What's going on with this world? And so we really have two lines of thought, and we're going to pit them against each other. I want to start by saying as well that in I think it was the summer of last year, maybe in the fall, we did a short series, I think it was 4 weeks long, called "Is Atheism Dead?" And it was based on a book by Eric Metaxas. So if you want a really great read, if you're a reader and you want to dig into some really great stuff that will help you in your Christian faith, "Is Atheism Dead?" And it goes through three kind of tenets that are scientific. In 1966, I believe it was, there was an issue of Time magazine. Everybody remember when we used to have magazines? This was an issue of Time magazine, so the equivalent for you today, if you are Gen Alpha or younger, the equivalent would be if something went viral. That would be the equivalent, because the Time magazine that was published went viral. And the title on it was, "Is God Dead?" It's still one of the best-selling Time magazine articles of all time. And the reason behind that, and we're going to allude to it in a minute, is there was an experiment that was done where an amino acid was created in a laboratory. Hang on, I think it was 1953. And there was an amino acid that was created in the laboratory. And so as soon as they created that, kind of out of thin air, we're going to experiment, we're going to put this together, they were like, yeah, we can create life. That was 1953. So relax, we're going to unpack all of that. But that spawned this idea that we don't believe in God anymore, but we believe in science, in the scientific method. And so all of a sudden, this evolution thing grew in power, had momentum, to the point where you probably learned about it in school more than creation. I think in 1953, there was no mention of evolution. Then there was a paragraph. And then now, if you go to the textbooks today, there's no mention of creation. It's just evolution. And so how times have changed. However, we're going to learn that science is proving more and more, the more we discover, the more they don't know anything about how we got here or how life is formed. And so the book mimicked the title, "Is God Dead?" And the book is entitled, "Is Atheism Dead?" And so I was thankful for this because I've already done all the research. So thank you to whoever put this in, because I had already this one basically done, except our thing was about 2 hours long, and I know I'm not going to take 2 hours. I'm going to take 35 minutes or so, but I think this will be helpful, and especially if you are Gen Alpha. So if you're going to school and you're learning about this stuff, this will give you the other side of the coin, as you probably never hear it anywhere else, okay? So for those of you, Xander and others that are in the crowd that are younger, you're never going to hear this anywhere unless you go looking for it, and some of those resources can be dicey. But I'm going to stand here today and proclaim the truth of God's Word, from God's Word, which is 3,500 years old and has stood the test of time. And the more we go forward with science, the more the Bible, they're going, how did the Bible know this 3,500 years ago? So just fasten your seatbelts, because that's kind of where we're going. So we're going to put both stories out there, and I'm not going to really do evolution any favors, but we're going to tell both stories, and then we're going to answer the question: what story best explains where we are right now? Okay, so that's the beginning. And I want to start with the biblical story of creation. And so we understand, so Jess, if you could change the slide, that'd be great. Well, actually, here's the big idea. And here's the point of the idea is that there is a commensurate change statistically, and I'm kind of going off script here, but there's a commensurate change, and you can fact check me on this, check it all out. When people believed that we came from apes, behaviors changed. What's the point? What's the point of not having premarital sex? What's the point of not being addicted to drugs or substances? What's the point of not hurting other people? What's the point of any of it? If it's just all chance and accident and it was just all this random mutations that brought us here, well then who cares how we live, right? Who cares? That's a story that is shaped out of the theology, and I'll call it theology because they call it science, but it's basically a religious belief. That story shapes how you live. And if you look at the statistics, they hockey stick after people believed and evolution is taught. Because what's the point? Who cares? Teenage pregnancies went up, abortion went up, all this stuff went up because who cares? That's the story. But if you come from the creation standpoint, well, there's a creator who created you. He has a purpose for your life and a plan for your life, and he has some expectations about how we do things here on earth. He created this earth, and we should live according to his plan. Well, that's a whole different story, isn't it? Right? We want to live to please him. We want to live according with his law. In Deuteronomy 6 and 7 and 5 and all those things, Moses is downloading the Shema. Hear, O Israel, Lord your God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And then it adds to this. It will go well with you if you do these things. So when you believe in a creator, there's one creator who created everything. Well, he kind of has the design for everything. Well, he should know what he's doing. If we hitch our wagon to him, we should be good. And that changes now how we don't live according to the way we feel, and we don't live in accordance with this kind of like, who cares mentality. No, we want to honor Jesus. We want to honor God, that he's the creator. Do you see how the story, right? The story changes. And here's the deal is that every culture tells a creation story, and Christians aren't unique in that. Even atheists have one too. It's called the Big Bang. The real question isn't whether you believe a story. It's which story explains the reality. And so that's the question we're asking. But then also the reason we're asking it underneath is because it's shaped. So let's go to the biblical story of creation. And these, I had so many verses. I had so many verses. I'm like, oh, Lord, they're not going to absorb all these verses. So I winnowed it down to 3. I figured, we're a triune church, so let's go with 3 scriptures. So let's go there. The obvious big one is Genesis 1. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Pretty straightforward. And by the way, verse 1, right? God's like, hey, you know what? Why don't I start with this story? This is verse 1 in your Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay. Pretty straight. He's like, let's just keep it simple. We're not going to go science-y. We're not going to tell you all the who's, what's, why's, where's, and how's, and all that stuff because they won't understand anyways. But in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered the deep waters, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness, and he called the light day and the darkness night. So we learn from this that the Bible doesn't argue for God, it begins with God. Before there was anything, there was God. Okay, so again, hard for us to get our minds wrapped around, but that's the principle. Let's go to the next one. Psalm 19, and I love this. David, this is just David kind of probably camped out one night, and he's just looking up at the stars, and he's like, wow. You ever done that? You're just on a rock up north somewhere, and you're just like, unbelievable. And so he says, the heavens proclaim the glory of God. Right? He's just looking at the stars and deducing something had to do with it. The skies display his craftsmanship. Day after day, they continue to speak. This is a 3,000-year-old psalm. So when he says day after day, it's 3,000 years of day after days. Just saying, because you've looked at the same stars that David looked at. Night after night, they make him known. They speak without a sound or word. their voice is never heard. Yet their message has gone throughout the earth, and their words to all the world. Isn't that powerful? There's somebody in Honduras, somebody in Malaysia. You know, you can all come to the same conclusion if you just look up into the skies and see God's design. Creation as a design. Here's what we're going to kind of end up on. It's creation as design. There's order, patterns, laws, beauty, mathematics, and purpose. And let's go to the next one, which is Romans, which kind of leads us further. For ever since the world was created, everybody say created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities. So the characteristics of God are shown in nature. His eternal power and divine nature. So they have no excuse for not knowing God, which kind of is a little bit hinting back to David. But here's where it goes off the rails. Claiming to be wise, they instead became utter fools. Instead of worshiping the glorious, ever-living God, they worshiped idols. So people were like, look at the starry host, there must be a God. Oh, I'm going to create this thing out of wood and I'm going to worship it and rub it for good luck. Right? It's like, are you nuts? Look at that. Look at this. You created that. Why? However, it's this human fallen nature that wants us to trust in things. And this is where we're going to kind of land toward the end of our time together. But, you know, this is where the Bible says there's no excuse for knowing God, whether people hear the gospel message specifically. But let me just summarize by going to this next slide. The biblical story, so here, if you're going to summarize the biblical story, because we're going to go to evolution in just a second. The biblical story is basically God exists before everything, then God speaks, as we heard. The universe comes into existence. That's it. We just have to trust that God did it and God knows what he's doing. Creation is intentional. Remember, God said, let there be. He's commanding it. Creation is ordered, and if you go through the steps, we didn't go through all 7, but there's an order to creation that is God's order. And scientifically, they're like, yeah, all of those piggyback. If you have that out of order, it doesn't work. Right? And then this other idea that creation is good. And so he talks about it. He's like, I did this. And I'm like, yeah, that's pretty good. You know, that's God saying that. It's pretty awesome. And then also, here's the next part. And so you could read this. I had this in as well, and I didn't put it in, but read it for yourself. In Genesis 2, human beings, that's you and me, are created in the image of God. In all the other things, he created them for us so that we could exist. But then when we were created in God's image. And so there's been lots of debate about what that exactly means, whether that means we're creative or that we have this God knowledge or this God shape, or whatever it is. That's a fact. That animals are not like that, the trees are not like that, but we are. Okay? And then God remains involved as sustainer. So we believe, there's a deistic belief that believes that our world is kind of like a clock. God created the clock and then wound it up and then said, okay, see you later. When the alarm comes, I'll come back, you know, to the earth or whatever. We don't believe that. We believe that God is the sustainer of life. And you have had transformative experiences with God, maybe salvation or healing, or maybe you've had another relationship restoration. God speaks into our lives, and so God remains involved. He's the God of all the universe, created it all. It's good. He's still involved. Good? Creation story. Okay, in 10 minutes or less. Okay, I got to go quicker with evolution. Okay, so the evolutionary story, 3 observations. Sorry, I forgot about this part. In the beginning, doesn't argue God, begins with him. Creation has design, so, all of that. And then creation has purpose. So we're not accidents. We're created for such a time, right? Bear God's image. Okay, let's go on. Evolutionary story. Okay, let's go on to the next one. So, evolutionary story. So the evolution doesn't really have a Bible, but if they did have a Bible, their Bible would be on the Origin of Species by a guy named Charles Darwin. Put up your hand if you've heard of Charles Darwin. Okay, the Beagle, USS Beagle, and he went to the Galapagos Islands and saw that finches had different beaks, and then he deduced that everything came by chance. Okay, which is like, wow, that's amazing. That's 1859. So only for the last about 170, 160 years have we actually believed this? There were a bunch of others, and I had them all in there, and I actually took them all out because there's too many. But the evolutionary story is essentially, it's a story of enlightenment. If you know about the Enlightenment, there's a guy named Descartes who came up with this philosophical idea that I think, therefore I am. Hey, I have thoughts, right? And so it's like kind of like, hey, aren't I special? And so then there's like all kinds of Machiavelli and all kinds of other guys in this enlightenment where they're kind of like, do we really need God? I know God kind of bosses us around, tells us what to do. Do we really need him? Because look at all the stuff we've done, all the stuff we can do. And as technology and culture and science has progressed, we have kind of thrown God to the back and trusted really into our own devices. And so Darwin hits that age of enlightenment real good, right? Because it's about 200 years after the age of enlightenment starts to come on the scene. And there's this proliferation of knowledge by the way of books, by what was his name? Drawing a blank. Printing press? Anyone? Does it matter? It matters. I want to get it. Who invented the printing? We're not going anywhere until we figure this out. Look it up on your phone. Gutenberg, thank you. Okay, Gutenberg, thank you. Right? Get us out of that pause moment. But so there's this proliferation of information. Remember, we had basically started to know that the whole earth was inhabited. For years they didn't know this. And it was basically just this. There's really no designer, and the on origin of species is really encapsulated by this third one, random mutation and natural selection. So all the birds had different beaks based on what kind of food they liked, or what kind of food they needed, and if there was a drought and they needed a long beak to get down in, they grew their beaks out longer. And so it's this mutation. They're kind of going, hey, maybe if all humans did this, maybe we started as this single cell amoeba and then developed all the way into who we are today. And now we can use opposable thumbs, and we have vision, and we love people, and we can dream, and all these things. So it's quite the story. So species gradually change over time. Let's go to the next slide. So here's the thing that I want to challenge, and maybe for some of the younger crowd, this would be great to tuck away. Because when people talk about evolution, they usually only talk about the third one, which is biological evolution. But really, we need several evolutions to transpire for evolution to actually be a thing. And if I go back to the history of evolution, when Charles Darwin started that, all science started to look for evidence of what Charles Darwin was proposing. And so when we looked at the stars, they used to believe that the universe was steady state, and then they realized everything was expanding because they got telescopes, and there was all of this stuff. And so they thought that they kind of duped God out of his place. But in the evolutionary story, there's not one evolution, there's four. Number one is the cosmic evolution. And this, you would know this by way of the Big Bang. So we all started with nothing, and then for no reason whatsoever, there was this Big Bang, and somehow all matter came into existence through this explosion that was random, and nobody even knows why it happened, but it produced everything: stars, galaxies, space, and time. And the universe is expanding with a beginning of about 13.8 billion years. So that was a long time ago. Okay? And so this is what science believes. That's cosmic evolution, which leads to, so then fast forward almost 13.8 billion years, chemical evolution. So the Earth is now in its place in the Milky Way galaxy. And all of a sudden, these chemical reactions start taking place on Earth, bonding and forming molecules in prebiotic structures. Okay, so that was just millions of years ago, right? First one was 13.8 billion, and this is just millions of years ago. But somehow these, amino acid gets with this amino acid, and all of a sudden they start to talk and get chummy, and maybe lightning strikes, and poof, there's life, right? But how did this begin? How did we go from cosmic evolution to chemical evolution? We have no idea. But that's what they say. And then from there, that single cell amoeba, that single cell organism, starts to grow arms, or starts to grow fins, first fins, tadpole, tail, first because we want to swim. We got to swim over there. Okay, tail, and then fins, and then da-da-da-da, all the way to, all the way to humanoids. And so it's pretty tricky. It's pretty tricky to get there because this believes we didn't evolve from apes. We essentially evolved from tadpoles. And so, okay, we needed millions of years to do that. And then from there, we would also talk about this cultural or technological evolution, which is they're proof positive because they're just like, yeah, we used to be cavemen. We figured out fire. We figured out the wheel. We figured out the printing press. We learn, we innovate, we grow, and we've done all that too. So all of that had to transpire. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So, that's kind of the story of evolution. And so you can see how these are two competing stories. And what I want to do is now I want to pit these two stories against each other. Okay? So don't go to sleep on me just yet. But these are the three big questions. And again, I had about 20 questions. So when we did our 2.5-hour debrief Bible study, we went through all of them. But I'm going to go three questions. Number one is, where did everything come from? Number two is, where did life come from? Everything meaning rocks and plants and trees and all that. And then, where did life come from? And then the third one is about the fine-tuned universe. And that's one thing, again, where you want to just tuck that away. Where did everything come from? So here's the big creationist argument question. And this is one that a guy named Aristotle actually posed. And he talked about this idea of a prime mover. And so he kind of deduced that everything on earth kind of had a form and a function, and there was a circle of life, and there was a food chain, and there was all of these ecosystems and things like that. And he was just like, all of these are in motion. How did these all get in motion? They didn't get in motion by themselves. They needed something or someone to put them in motion. And he called it the prime mover. And so from the biblical worldview, in the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. We read that. In the evolutionary view, this is just an accidental Big Bang. But when you think about, well, where did everything come from? What caused the Big Bang? And why is there something instead of nothing? So dialing back on Aristotle, he asked the question, how does something come from nothing? Because scientifically, that premise doesn't hold water in any other place. Something coming from nothing, right? You walk home and you see an apple pie on the counter, and, it's like, whew. Wife comes home. She's like, where's the apple pie? I ate it. You ate all of it? Yeah. I just thought it just miraculously appeared, so I didn't think it, right? I made that pie. That pie was for somebody else, right? Down the street or whatever, right? It's just like, oh, I just thought it just randomly appeared. Maybe a bad example. There's a famous comedian, and I've sanitized this because I think he makes an amazing point. In his reel, there is some language that is not appropriate for church, so I've sanitized it. Here's what he says. This is a guy named Pete Holmes, and that's a summary of this, but it says, it doesn't matter if you're an atheist, he says, he proposes that we're all basically in the same boat. He says some people think that God created the universe, and some people think that nothing created the universe, and we're pitting these stories against each other. And he says, which is the funniest guess? God created the universe, or nothing created the universe? And then he says, and then the nothing people make fun of the God people, and they say God doesn't exist. And I'm like, okay, maybe, but you know what definitely doesn't exist? Nothing. That's the defining characteristic of nothing, is that it doesn't exist. And then he goes on. He says, so what are we talking about? Either you think it's God, something you can't see, touch, taste, photograph, and science can't prove, or you think it's nothing, something you can't see, touch, taste, photograph, or science can't prove. But I think we can all agree, if your nothing spontaneously erupts into everything, well, that's a pretty magical nothing. You ask the nothing people, what happens when you die? And they'll tell you, nothing. You go into nothing. And I'm like, oh, you mean you merge back with your Creator? Is that heaven? Right? You get his point. This is huge for evolutionists. This is part of the story where they cannot overcome. Let's go to the next one. This is the second one. So where did life come from? If you want to follow a guy online, James Tour, he's a microbiologist, and he can take you down a rabbit hole. And he is a doctor, and he has really posed. I learned a lot from just taking in some of his content. Believer, he's a Jewish believer, and he talks a lot about this. Where did life come from? So we know from the biblical worldview that God created mankind in his own image, male and female, he created them. That's Genesis 1:27. The evolutionary view is this is where evolution becomes more difficult. Natural selection explains its changes in living things. It does not explain how life began. So if you pose this to any evolutionary person, any atheist, and say, yes, but how did life begin? I'll go with you that we came from tadpoles. I'm going to give you that, but when did life start, and why did it start, and how did it start? And there is not a person who can answer that question. So going back to what we started with, 1953, they did this experiment, and they kind of, by a miracle, created an amino acid in a laboratory, and they put out this Time magazine article, we've created life. It's not life, it's one of multiple building blocks that you need for life. But you know what? Since 1953, they haven't made one significant improvement on that discovery. They haven't done it again, and they haven't made improvements on it since 1953. So this question, again, if you want to actually ask the question, which is the better guess here, evolution does not give you an ounce of help on this one. But if you want to believe that there's a God who actually created all of this, well, you can kind of trust. You can trust that. You can go to the bank on it, given that this was the first lesson, the lesson that he told us. Okay? So the third one, and maybe let me just tell you this too. Here's maybe what you learned in science and you're still hanging on to, which is totally different, because if you look into abiogenesis and the human cell, by the way, you have 1 trillion cells in your body that are just kind of cooking away right now without you doing anything. God put that all in place. And they used to believe that the cell was just this gelatinous mush, just kind of had something in it. They didn't really even know what, but the idea was that cell just kind of like did something else, And there really is no story to this. It's just this fictional deal that there was just this glob of goo, and the glob of glue grew a tail and swam up on there's just really no story to it. And this is why I say science has actually disproved evolution, because that's the evolutionary theory. Somehow in the primordial ooze, a couple of this and that's got together, some nitrogen got together with some oxygen, got together with something, and all of a sudden, boom, we have a cell, and it's living. Can't prove that. Doesn't make any sense, even if it's just a gelatinous little glob of something. However, let me just tell you this, that as they have figured out microscopes and have looked into cells, if you look into the cell of a human being, you find it's not just a glob of something. It is a city functioning perfectly. It is the equivalent of a city there's all of these different things that are doing this and interacting with each other, and then they form stuff. There's DNA in there. There's all kinds of little things in one little cell. In fact, one little cell holds all kinds of information. It would just blow your mind, and you have about 1 trillion of them. So it's not one glob of something that just kind of mutated. It's actually completely designed. So that cell had to work immediately upon life. So I don't know if you caught that, but anyways, check out Frank Tour. He'll explain it to you. Okay, question 3. Okay, go past this one. I'm going to leave that one because maybe I've heard that. Okay, here's my favorite one of all. And if you go down to the bottom there's a famous atheist. He was a debater. He was just an absolute miserable person. And he was in all the debates. His name's Christopher Hitchens. Anybody seen any of his stuff? Christopher Hitchens? No? Can I get a witness? Okay, yeah. He really does not like God or any of that. He calls it all a fairy tale. There was this video footage that came out of him, he was in an Uber or a taxi or something. It's all grainy and dark, and somebody just had a video camera. He may or may not have known it was rolling at the time, but he figured it out later on and kind of alluded to it. But this stark raving atheist, expert in all things atheism and evolution, was once asked in the back of a cab on camera, if you were on the other side of the argument, what would you use to disprove atheism? How do you prove Christianity? And this was his argument. He said, atheists can't get over the fine-tuning of the universe. And so the biblical view is that in the beginning God created everything, and it just works. The evolutionary view is like, we don't know. And is there a Carl Sagan quote there? Let's go to just the next one. Here's what we're talking about with finely tuned universe. So this is what people have deduced, is that we live on a Goldilocks planet, in a Goldilocks solar system, in a Goldilocks galaxy, in a Goldilocks universe. And so what do we mean by this? You know the story of Goldilocks, right? Tries the porridge, too cold, too hot, just right. So we know, well, Carl Sagan in 1966, he said there's only two requirements for life: the right kind of star and a planet to be the right distance from it. It's like, oh, okay. Yeah. We're 93 million miles from the sun, and if we were any closer, we would burn up, and we were any further away, we'd freeze. So it's like, okay, good. And so he said that's all there is to it. And so this idea of the finely tuned universe says there's a delicate balance whereby all the water would have evaporated up, or, you know, this idea of the linebackers of Jupiter and Saturn, which takes up all the asteroids and all of those kinds of things. They pull them in, so does the moon and all this kind of stuff. Is this a coincidence? Because we are third rock from the sun, as we know, and we're a galaxy that's in one of the spiral arms of the Milky Way galaxy, which is just far enough away to not be in the inhabitable zone and all that kind of stuff. So it's just like we were placed here on purpose. It's mysterious. Let's go to the next slide. I'll just leave that where it is, and then go on to the second thing about the finely tuned universe. So take that Goldilocks planet first, and then the second one is this, is the moon. It's more than just a nightlight. The Earth's moon is 27% the size of our planet. It's outrageously large compared to every other moon. I won't go through all the other planets, but a lot of planets have no moons. A lot of planets have tons of little tiny moons, and we're the only one that has a moon that's about the quarter of the size of our Earth. And so what does that mean? It means that the axis that we're on, 23.5, which, of course, we also know if it was 22 or 24, we would be dead. But that axial tilt is held by the gravitational pull of the moon. So they've discovered this. Prevents chaotic climate swings. We know that the moon creates ocean tides that support marine ecosystems. The moon helps the Earth's rotation not to spin out of control, making it stable. And it shields the Earth from asteroids and impacts. If you've ever seen the surface of the moon, it is just riddled, right? Like, and you're like, why doesn't the Earth look like that? It's because the moon is outside, and if anything comes close, the gravity of the moon pulls it in. Influences biological rhythms from coral spawning to migration, and there's a whole bunch of things that we believe the moon impacts us from that. But it's this idea that the moon is what it is and is not something different that is just very peculiar. And you look up at the moon, you don't think anything of it, but then the more you think about the moon and the more science has looked at the moon, they're like, if we did not have the moon, we would not exist. It's just that simple. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, actually, just go back. Okay. One of the interesting facts, and I love this about the moon, and this might be just anecdotal evidence or whatever, but the size of the moon and the distance of the moon from us, and the size of the sun and the distance from us are like night and day, if I can use that term. Isn't that good to use that for the moon? So the sun is 1 million times the size of the Earth, The moon is 25% the size of the Earth. So 4 million moons can fit inside the sun. But do you know we're the only planet in the solar system that can have an eclipse, whereby the moon, being the distance it is from the Earth, and the sun being the exact distance it is, the moon can completely cover the sun. We saw that just a couple years ago. And so people, scientists look at this and just go like, how? Like, how is that possible that something this small and of sort of no significance can blot out something that is very significant and also just enormous? And so it's just kind of uncanny. It's not a little bit too big, and it's not a little bit too small. It is exactly the same size when they overlap. And so again, this is one of those where it's just like, that's just freaky. Why is that? I don't know. But when you start to add up all of these things, science actually is telling the story that they don't really have any answers. They don't have any answers. And so when you dial back to, let's just believe that God did all this, you kind of have an easier time for sure. Okay, fine-tuning question. So you can look this up for yourself. Goldilocks universe, the moon, and then the 4 fundamental forces. And so if you were already asleep or if you were on your way to sleep, this is going to put you right to sleep. But from a science standpoint, these 4 fundamental forces, this is finely tuned, finely tuned world. These 4 things exist, and none of us are aware of them. And probably before today, you would not have heard of, except for gravity, any of these. But all of these are absolutely essential. Any deviation, and we're talking the most minutest of deviations, and we would not exist. For instance, gravity. I know you hate gravity when you stand on the scale, don't you? Like, darn you, gravity! Give me a break! Right? Gravity holds us to the earth. You know what? Gravity doesn't hold us too much. But gravity doesn't hold us not enough either. Just enough where we can walk and move, and, you know, for me, I can jump maybe 2 or 3 inches. For other people, they can jump higher, right? You can beat that gravity. But gravity is so important. You develop bones and structure in your body according to gravity and the gravitational pull. Do you know if we went to any other planet, we could never exist because our bones would turn to mush. We wouldn't be able to walk on. We would just be like floating away. We'd never be tethered. And so I know we don't think about this, but gravity is precisely exactly how much it needs to be for us to live on Earth. Now, get this. If, for instance, there was a Big Bang, because gravity is a constant in the scientific world, that would mean from the instance of the Big Bang, gravity had to exist. So gravity could not evolve, right? We needed it right from the get-go. In fact, all of the solar systems revolve around this idea of gravity. It had to exist, and nobody even really knows what it is. Like, how do you do it? How do you get, it's still a mystery. Then the electromagnetic force, which governs electricity, magnetism, light, and the chemical bonds. Its ratio with gravity is precisely tuned for life. So we learned about that last week, right? Haley came and she talked about the true north, and that there's this there's this electromagnetic force, and so you can have a compass and you can go, okay, well, there's true north, or is it really, right? There's this magnetic sense of the world that actually is required for everything that goes on. And then there's these 2 that, again, this is such nerdy stuff, but it's so important, and you have no idea how important it is. The weak nuclear force, nuclear meaning really small, right? Atomic. So lets electrons move between atoms, perfectly calibrated against the strong force. So weak nuclear force is like when and I'm way out of my depth in science here, but it's this idea that life needs electrons to be moving from one thing to another. And those electrons spin, and you guys know the periodic table, and certain elements have a certain amount of electrons, and then they're exchanged. And so if you ever put baking soda into water, you know all the electrons go crazy, and it fizzes all over the place, right? If you did the volcano thing when you were in school. Yeah, okay, whatever. So weak nuclear force, so it lets electrons. So that's the one that lets electrons out. But then by the same token, there's a strong nuclear force. So remember, we're talking about atoms, atomic particles. There's the strong nuclear force that holds the protons and neutrons together. So you have a little tiny atom. Electron, you may go. Yes, we give you permission. Proton, neutron, you must stay. You understand, you understand the deal here? With the proton, like if the proton was to go or the neutron was to go, everything would just fall apart. So science can't figure out how in the world, right down, not just the cell, but to the atom, there is a design where electrons are free to go, and when they exchange, certain things happen, and you can make volcano things in your science project in grade 8. But in terms of the strong nuclear force, there are things like this table where it's just like, you know, it's sturdy and strong and whatever, and everything fuses together. They can't explain any of these, and these are all necessary for life. Without any of them, we would all be up the creek. Okay, so let's summarize all this and let's get moving. So here's the deal, right? You have three options. I'm going to give you three options to answer your question. Necessity, chance, or design. Those are really the only three, okay? So contrary, let me just go back to Carl Sagan's. Remember he said there's only two? Just that we have a sun and it's the right distance. That's it, 1966. As we've gone forward in science, there are literally hundreds of things that need to be exact. And they needed to be exact from the Big Bang. Hundreds of things that need to be exact for life to exist. And it's funny, the more we learn, the more the odds are stacked against this evolutionary idea that we all are just a random accident that happened and then mutated, and then here we are. So Carl Sagan is turning over in his grave today. Was wrong, big time, even though he was like the big guy. In 1966, there's actually, he's got a wicked haircut too, if you want to check that out. Just check out Carl Sagan, 1966, and it's one of those like, you know, and he's just got that big bowl cut. He's like, yes, millions of years ago, and it's just fantastic. Anyways, check it out, you'll laugh. So we have three options here. Number one is necessity. That it just, what happened out of the Big Bang happened out of the Big Bang, and it just happened accidentally, but all by necessity, although we don't really know why. So it just did happen. We're in the Goldilocks world, in the Goldilocks universe, in the Goldilocks galaxy, in the Goldilocks place in the universe. We don't know why, but we're here. Hey! And then we don't really know anything else, but by necessity we developed eyes and lungs and livers, and right? And we got limbs and everything just by necessity. I would always ask the question, how did we know we needed eyes? And what started first in the eye? Because the eye is not just one single thing, it's complex. What, you know, ask about necessity in the cell. Well, the cell is like a city, and you got 1 trillion of them. How did that come together? So that is, wow, that's pretty fictional. And then by chance, so then it's just like, yeah, whatever. Not by necessity, but it's just random luck. But the further we go, that story doesn't seem to hold water. But the last option we have here is that this was all designed. And it's specific. And it's not just a little bit specific. It is so precise that if it was if any of these hundreds of things was off by a degree, we wouldn't be here. So it's this God who is omniscient, omnipotent, and creative, and all of those things said, let there be light, and there was light. And he designed it all. So from the necessity or chance people, we would ask the question, how can order come from chaos? So those are all of the notes that I have on that. Well, it's not all the notes, but it's all you're getting today. So let's go. Do we have Romans 1? Can we go back? Hang on. Yeah, no, this is it. This is where it just gets humbling. And I honestly think that most people don't come to faith in God or remain atheists even though the information is right there in front of them. It's because we're prideful. And so when you're prideful and you want nothing to do with God and you don't want to believe in God because God's going to demand of you things and demand of you to live certain ways, you just want to prove any way that you can that he doesn't exist. It doesn't matter. I don't really need to. Aspire to this or whatever. And Romans said it well. Paul said it so well. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Here's where the pride comes in. And the humility. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities. And this is before Carl Sagan and before all these scientific discoveries. His eternal power and divine nature. So they have no excuse for God. Actually, can you go back to that first one because it has that second part to it? No, go back to the Romans or at the beginning of the sermon. Because it has this line in it. No, go back to one more. Perfect. Okay, so here's the back half of that, right? In 23 it says, so they have no excuse for not knowing God. Claiming to be wise, they instead became utter fools. Instead of worshiping the glorious, ever-living God, they worshiped idols. So I think about guys like Christopher Hitchens, and he's just like, the fine-tuning argument. I cannot poke a hole in that at all, but I'm still going to be an atheist. I'm still going to go to my grave and not claim God. Why? I think it's just pride. I think it's just pride. And so it's this idea of humility and trust, and it's like, yeah, we don't have it all under control. We can't figure it all out. We can't make sense of it all. But there's a God that we need to submit to in our lives. Interestingly, and maybe I might edit this out of the video, but it's for your consumption only. Interestingly, there was a law that was just passed called Bill C-9, and you know what one of the books was that was taken out of books that I can actually refer to in these public settings? It's Romans, specifically this chapter. Kind of crazy, just coming to me as I'm going to go to jail. Visit me, would you? I don't know. I might not go to jail. I could go to jail. If one of you were to complain, there could be some problems. Police would be at my door. If you want just a fun one, just read Job. Yeah, we all know the story of Job, lost everything and all that stuff. Just read when Job starts to give God some lip toward the end of the book, right? Job 37, 38, it was 38, 39, 40, and 41. And God asked Job the question. We're asking the question, which story is better? And God asked Job the question, hey, by the way, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Oh, you're coming at me. You think you know better than me? And God, there's a bunch of questions. It's fantastic. So just check out that Job. Okay, let's go to the very end slide, Jessica, and then we'll conclude. So we're asking the question, what story is better? These are the questions that I kind of come up with. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why does life have value, right? We have all of these feelings and emotions. Why do beauty and order exist? Why do we long for meaning in our lives? And why should we be accountable for how we live? All of those are innate in us, right? God says he's put eternity in our hearts so that we would follow him. And I believe we should believe that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the simplicity answer. And so here is the crux of the issue is, are you willing to humble yourself and believe in God, or are you wanting to remain prideful and think you have all the answers? I think that those are our two issues. When you humble yourself before the Lord, it means some things. It means you have to live your life according to him. And if you do, things will go better for you. He'll be with you. This other story that is being told, that it just came from whatever, tadpoles or rocks or whatever. It's just an accident. None of it matters. So if you want to believe that, you can live according to that as well. I believe the Bible says when we humble ourselves, we see God move in our lives. It's interesting that Jesus doesn't ask us to do anything that he doesn't do himself. If you read Philippians 2, it says that he humbled himself, right? Didn't think his God had to be something to be grasped, but he took it off. Stepped down into humanity, took on the human flesh, and then submitted to death, the death on a cross. God humbled himself. He's not asking us to do anything that he didn't do, but we have to humble ourselves under God's mighty hand. And that's the secret to life. All right, week 1 in the books.